So maybe just a quick first question, because we've been, a big part of this is coming from the situation in Europe. I think everybody agrees on that. And whether we have a mild recession. I have a question from the outside eventually. I have the impression for the past 1 or 2 years, each time we have the impression something is settling, then you got the new country coming out of the new market, like if someone is kind of organizing one after the other. So what would be the next one? Is a bit my question now. Should we expect another country to go into trouble and have all the financial markets fear, euro going down again? So is this kind of organized way? Rajiv, maybe?
Yeah, at the moment I don't think I have another one coming on the list so quickly. It was really, after Greece and Portugal and Ireland.
Sorry, can you hear?
Oh. So after Greece, Portugal and Ireland, obviously they had their bailouts. And then I think it was really very much the focus on Spain. I don't think we have, and then of course the question is with Italy, how will the issue be addressed, as I discussed earlier, of the rising bond yields and the cost of financing their debt. So that debt sustainability issue with Italy is very much a concern, but if that's addressed by the Eurozone governments, then I think which involves basically buying Italian sovereign debt on a continuous basis to keep the yields down, then I think we should be able to avoid that situation with Italy as long as they do it. If they don't do it, then Italy could also be the next one coming on the list, unfortunately. And that's both Spain and Italy are amongst the big 5 EU countries, so these are very, very major escalations in the crisis if that happens.
I'm a little bit more perhaps pessimistic in this regard. In economic terms, exactly, I do agree. But when one looks at Europe, one looks at the unemployment levels, for instance, one also has to look at the youth unemployment levels. If you have youth unemployment level of 50% in Greece, it's the same in Spain. If you have 36% or so in Portugal and Italy, this is very, very serious. It's unsustainable in the long run. And it will define an entire generation. We have a parallel. It was 1920s and 1930s, a very different kind of a society, not so globally interdependent. But I'm concerned that the issues we're talking about, that we have to talk about, relate to the debt issues, the bond issues, that are the immediate short-term, perhaps even medium-term issues. But there's also something seriously flawed in the growth model that we have in many European countries. Without robust growth, you cannot really sustain the kind of a welfare, social safety nets that you've had so far. There are efforts to revise this in Denmark, by the way, some very intriguing experiments, but they may come too late. And that would be my concern. And you see it, for instance, in Greece. Started with the government discussions among the Socialist PASOK party, moved towards the New Democracy Conservatives, and now to the Radical Left party, which will probably get a third of the vote in the next elections. That's a very important sign. So the problems were created with governments that will play a minor role when those problems have to be resolved. So what kind of resolutions will you then have?
No, I very much agree. I mean, I think one thing is the spillover in the short term and the risk associated with that. But I agree, medium term, number one, Europe needs to get out of this significant structural reforms that would take time to kick in and have impact. They've only just begun talking about these structural reforms you can say in the periphery countries. They're increasingly being forced to implement them. So one silver lining could be that it's expedited the implementation of structural reforms that would probably have been too slow to roll out in the first place. So if one had to take a positive spin on it, to some extent there's some acceleration at that time. But I think it's important to recognize that one thing is crisis resolution, which is a short-term thing, using existing stabilization mechanisms to cushion against a deeper recession. But the biggest crisis is really structural in nature, and it takes several years to solve it. And then, as I also would say, in addition to that, as was mentioned by Dan, you have the fiscal time bomb. That's related to the aging problem. even before this crisis started, most European countries' fiscal positions were unsustainable if you look at it from a demographic perspective, because of the rising impact on spending on an aging population, the associated decline in basically tax revenues as a consequence of that. So not only do they have to get over the hump that was associated with the debt burden that was built up during the property boom bust in some countries, but they also have to prepare a strengthening of the fiscal position to meet, in a sense, the aging-related fiscal mountain of debt that's going to build up. I used to work at the IMF, and we did some 50-year simulations of what the fiscal situations look like in many European countries if we just continued with current policies, and it was not a very encouraging picture.
Any question from the room at that stage? Yeah, over there.
Hi, morning. I'm from DBS Bank. I would like to ask about the fiscal sustainability issue here. It is not something new that we are seeing those countries that has gone busted, overspending, right? Yeah, they've been spending for many, many years. They haven't got any fiscal discipline at all for many, many years. But what is it all of a sudden things happen right now? And leading on to my next question is, do we actually see our rating agencies being, in a way, very culpable in causing this entire mess in Europe? Thank you.
Back prior to 2008 and even 2009, it was still the case that there wasn't much difference between the cost of the financing, the bond yields in Spain and Italy compared to German bonds. So basically you were getting relatively cheap financing of the sovereign debt, and that was quite manageable for protracted periods of time. And so they didn't feel any sense of urgency to deal with their fiscal deficit problems. And at that point, back in 2009, actually Spanish sovereign debt was actually relatively moderate compared to many other European countries, and certainly moderate compared to Italy. But things have changed very substantially since then, and in particular the escalation of, or the divergence in yields between Germany and, say, Italy and Spain is really now what's creating this issue about fiscal sustainability, because you can't raise at 7% yields or even maybe more on a sustainable basis when you've got such high government debt levels as 120% of GDP. And now this is becoming no longer manageable for Italy, and Spain is heading in that direction as well, because now, again, they're finding the reason they had to get this bailout for their banks is because they cannot tap capital markets at the market yields in order to finance this 100 billion, and that's why they want relatively cheaper financing package. So, this is the real issue that they're confronting. And the challenge now to survive the medium term while they're doing their restructuring is how do you get those yields down to sustainable rates of, maybe 5% or less.
And done.
Yes, I couldn't agree more when it comes to the immediate issues at hand. But when one looks at why so many troubles so fast, why so deep troubles, think of a window that has a little crack. When it's nice weather, it really doesn't matter. It's there and it should be, you should replace it, but it sort of can contain whatever is outside. But if you have a real storm, it won't do. The cracks will spread, and they will spread very fast. And I think that's what we're dealing with. And as I've been working on my own little book about these affairs now for 5 years, come to the conclusion that perhaps the economic development that started in the late 1980s, that we used to call the Great Moderation, wasn't about moderation at all. Perhaps it was about a great acceleration. Because when you create an equilibrium that's based on the idea that the G7 countries can have debt per GDP in the next few decades, that will be around 440%, which I think, remember IMF concluding at one point of time. It is simply unsustainable. So there are immediate issues, as you mentioned, and a lot of my Italian friends would immediately point out that there's a huge difference between us and the Spaniards or the Greeks, and they do have a point. But the moment the present Prime Minister, Mario Monti, will leave his post, and there will be a political coalition, you will find that the volatility that we've seen until now will be far more so. So these problems go way back, but you cannot deal with the structural reasons without containing with the immediate reasons, as you well pointed out. And that, I think, is a real problem, because then you're dealing with different political constituencies. There will be people who will say, why are the banks being bailed out in Spain when my child has been without work for X number of months? And these issues were containable when the crisis lasted 6 months, 12 months. Now you want to see results. And that will, I think, create more extreme positions, which is what we've seen elsewhere. And United States is no different from this. They've just skillfully deferred every important decision up to December 2012 or January 2013. But then they have to create a credible plan for adjustment as well.
Yeah, but